It's a pleasure to be speaking here at this event hosted by the Ahlul Bayt Societies of London University on a subject as important as Bahrain. Bahrain I often describe as the forgotten revolution of 2011. That's Bahrain, the forgotten revolution of this year. It's the revolution that wasn't televised. Despite the clips we see there, those are not clips that made it onto BBC or ITV or Sky News on any kind of regular or semi-regular basis. It's a revolution that didn't get the airtime it deserved and still doesn't, partly because the Bahraini regime very cleverly kicked out all of the foreign camera crews at the very beginning, including Al Jazeera's, partly because the media as a whole, in particular and shamefully the Western media, hasn't been interested in Bahrain. Not interested, not important. Most journalists I know here in London would struggle to find Bahrain on a map of the Middle East. That's the sad truth. I want to talk briefly this evening about 4 specific issues. 1, what's going on in Bahrain, what's been going on in Bahrain while the world has looked elsewhere. Number 2, why is it being ignored, both by the government and by the media here in the West. Number 3, why it matters. Not my problem as the question posed. And number 4, what Shia Muslims in particular need to watch out for. So number 1, what's been happening in Bahrain? How did it all kick off? I want to read to you, forgive me, from one of the rare Western journalists to have covered Bahrain in depth, in detail, with passion. Not many, but one of them was an eyewitness. You may know him, Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, who wrote a column on the 17th of February, 3 days after the Arab Spring reached Pearl Square in Manama, in the capital of Bahrain. And it was entitled, "Blood Runs Through the Streets of Bahrain." And remember, Kristof is not some radical, left-wing, countercultural blogger. He's as mainstream as you can get. One of America's most respected foreign affairs, centrist, liberal, pragmatic, reasonable New York Times columnist. And yet he wrote, after watching the violence with his own eyes, quote, "As a reporter, you sometimes become numb to sadness, but it's heartbreaking to be in modern, moderate Bahrain right now and watch as a critical American ally uses tanks, troops, guns and clubs to crush a peaceful democracy movement and then lie about it." He then described what happened. The pro-democracy movement has bubbled for decades in Bahrain, but it found new strength after the overthrow of the dictatorships in Tunisia and Egypt. Then the Bahrain government attacked the protesters earlier this week with stunning brutality, firing tear gas, rubber bullets and shotgun pellets at small groups of peaceful, unarmed protesters. 2 demonstrators were killed, one while in a funeral procession, and widespread public outrage gave a huge boost to the democracy movement. King Hamad bin Isa al Khalifa initially pulled the police back, but early on Thursday morning he sent in the riot police, who went in with guns blazing. Bahrain television has claimed that the protesters are armed with swords and threatening security. That's preposterous. I was on the roundabout earlier that night and saw many thousands of people, including large numbers of women and children, even babies. Many were asleep. More than 600 people were treated with injuries, overwhelmingly men, but including small numbers of women and children. He mentions meeting a Dr. Ekri, a distinguished plastic surgeon who had returned from Houston. He says he identified himself as a physician to the riot police, but the riot police handcuffed him and began beating him with sticks and kicking him while shouting insults against Shias. Finally, the police pulled down his pants and threatened to rape him. Kristof concluded, this is back in February in the New York Times, "When a king opens fire on his own people, he no longer deserves to be a ruler. That might be the only way to purge this land of ineffable heartbreak." Since that February when it all kicked off, human rights activists inside and outside of Bahrain, and we have some experts here tonight who know far more than me, they say more than 40 civilians have been killed, a minimum, that's the official figure. More than 40 civilians have been killed, including 5 who died from torture while being detained under custody, including many children, the most recent unbelievable atrocity being the alleged tear gassing to death of a 5-day-old newborn baby on Sunday by Bahraini riot police. And let me just deal with this. You'll hear this rather nonsensical argument. I've debated a few people on this subject, and you often hear this argument that Bahrain, apologists for the Khalifa family, they say Bahrain can't be compared to other uprisings. It's nonsense to compare. That's not fair. Look how many people died in Bahrain compared to how many people died in Egypt or Tunisia or other places. In fact, 40 people out of a population of 1.2 million is proportionately almost exactly the same as the number of people who've been killed in other countries. For example, 850 people in Egypt out of a population of 81 million, 300 people in Tunisia out of a population of 10.5 million. So let's not buy this nonsense argument that the deaths are somehow minimized or not important in Bahrain. And it's not just about the deaths either. Don't forget, according to the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, or BICI, established by the Bahraini king in July, so not quite sure how independent it can claim to be, but even the BICI confirms that hundreds have been tortured, shot at, tear-gassed, injured, maimed, wounded, in addition to the deaths. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillai, has condemned the tactics of the Bahraini regime as, quote, shocking and illegal conduct. One of the most horrifying aspects of the crackdown, and every crackdown in every Arab country had its own particularly horrifying feature. In Bahrain, it's been the treatment of medical professionals, doctors and nurses who treated protesters and then dared to speak about it to journalists afterwards and were then arrested. 48 medical professionals, doctors and nurses, arrested and put on trial. More than 1,600 people have been arrested so far during the protests. 4 people have been sentenced to death in military tribunals held behind closed doors. 2,000 people across the country, almost all of them Shias, in a country where the Shias are the majority but ruled by a minority Sunni ruling family, backed by Sunni Saudi Arabia, almost 2,000 people have been dismissed or suspended from work. And according to an investigation by Al Jazeera, 28 Shia mosques and shrines have been either destroyed or heavily damaged by the authorities. Few have been spared from the wrath of the Khalifas. Even Bahrain's top footballers have been arrested, detained and tortured by Saudi security forces. One of their friends told a newspaper, "You're British. Imagine David Beckham were to get arrested and tortured. It's unthinkable." Well, not in Bahrain. It's not unthinkable. And you've got to then ask the question, if it's so horrific and so bad, why is it being ignored? Why hasn't it got the same level of attention? And it is being ignored. Let's not be under any illusions about violence. Despite a few stories the other week when the BICI report finally emerged on the violence, on what happened, apart from a few stories on the BBC, etc., about that report, there's been very little coverage, sustained, detailed coverage of what's going on in Bahrain. Compare that to, and this is not just the Western media, let's talk about the regional Arab media. Let's talk about Al Jazeera and all of those channels, Al Arabiya, etc., etc. Those channels, without which you wouldn't have been able to have an uprising in Tahrir Square in Egypt, without which the Tunisians wouldn't have been able to bring down Ben Ali, or the Libyans get the attention of the world. That crucially important local regional media hasn't played that same role in Bahrain, hasn't turned with similar attention to what's going on or cheerleaded the protesters on the streets of Pearl Square, some of those scenes we saw on the Ahlul Bayt TV clip just then. I mean, the reason it's being ignored in the region is very simple, and we can come on to this in discussion, and that is, very, very straightforwardly, that the Sunni majority in the Middle East, the rulers, I should say, rather than the people, are absolutely petrified at the idea of another Arab state going Shia, in the way that Iraq did after 2003. And therefore, the Khalifas have been seen by the rest of the Gulf Arab rulers, and by the rulers in Jordan and Egypt and the rest, as an essential bulwark against Shia, and for Shia, you can read Iran, influence in the Middle East, in the Arab world, and we'll come on to this in a moment. Here in the West, we've had the odd report on the BBC, we've had the odd report in The Guardian, we had the odd front page when the doctors were arrested and tried on the front page of The Independent, hats off to them for a rare front page on this story. But otherwise, again, the Western media has not covered it with the same glee and excitement and passion and enthusiasm and vigour as it covered Egypt and Tunisia and especially Libya. Why? Because Bahrain and the revolution in Bahrain does not fit with Western strategic interests. And the media in this country, if you've ever been under any doubt about what agenda our mainstream press follows in this country, you only need to look at Bahrain. Because the reason the press are not covering the story is because they haven't been given the same lead by the governments in the way that they were on Egypt, etc., etc., especially Libya, of course, where we actually took military action. Look at the way that Western governments encouraged the protests in Egypt and Tunisia, belatedly, but they did. In Syria, they called openly for regime change and continue to do so. And in Libya, of course, USA, UK, France took military action to physically remove Gaddafi's 42-year tyranny. And yet in Bahrain, all we hear is political reform. We need some reform. We need some dialogue. We need to improve the police. That's the contrast when we see the death and the torture And the violence. I was at a dinner recently with some it was an off-the-record dinner, so I can't really quote what was going on, but it was with some very influential British Muslims, and it was a private dinner, and the subject of the Arab Spring came up, etc., and the subject turned to Bahrain. And one of the people at the table said, well, the difference with Bahrain is complicated. You hear that word often. Bahrain is complicated. So I said, what's complicated? Oh no, it's very complicated, the factors that are going on, the politics of it. I said, it's not complicated. It's very, very simple. In fact, it's the simplest one of all. The reason we are not intervening in Bahrain, or taking action on Bahrain, or hearing Bahrain at the top of our newscasts, is because the US Fifth Fleet is stationed in Bahrain. And it's long been the policy of both the Bahraini government and the US government to ensure that that fleet stays there. In fact, in 1975, when the current king's father tried to do a little bit of an experiment with constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy in Bahrain, and the National Assembly voted not to extend the US naval lease in Bahrain, he simply dissolved the National Assembly and ended that experiment with parliamentary democracy. So this is a long-running issue. The Americans are very clear about their position on Bahrain. There's no hiding this. It's not conspiracy theory. Openly, the Americans in Congress designated Bahrain in 2002 as a major non-NATO ally. Very few countries have that title. It's an official American diplomatic and legal position voted on and passed by the US State Department to declare Bahrain as a major non-NATO ally. At the height of the violence, Admiral McMullen, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, turned up in Bahrain to support the rule. While it was going on in February this year, the then Defense Secretary Robert Gates turned up in Bahrain to give a full-throated endorsement of the regime. It is truly shameful. And this has been going on for a while. Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, turned up in Bahrain in December, and she said Bahrain is a, quote, a model partner. She said she was, quote, very impressed by the progress that Bahrain is making on all fronts, economically, politically, socially. In fact, in the month before the protests began, the United States sold more than $200 million of weapons and equipment to Bahrain, including $760,000 of firearms. Now, some might say, well, you can't blame the United States. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know that there was going to be this crackdown. They thought Bahrain was on the path to reform. Rubbish. The US State Department's own human rights reform, you can read it for yourself, its own human rights report, 2010, on its website, said, way before the protests kicked off in February 2011, quote, citizens did not have the right to change their government in Bahrain. Discrimination on the basis of gender, religion, nationality, and sect, especially against the Shia majority population, persisted. There were multiple allegations of mistreatment and torture, especially of Shia activists associated with opposition groups. The government restricted civil liberties, including freedoms of speech, press, assembly, association, and some religious practices. The Shias are underrepresented in positions of leadership in the civil service, police, and security forces. That's the State Department report last year, before they decided to sell $200 million of weapons. Hillary Clinton say you're a model partner, and Admiral McMullen and Defense Secretary Gates turn up to say, all is fine here, we're with you. In fact, one official in the Obama administration, you want brazenness for the double standards, one official in the US government told the Wall Street Journal under the condition of anonymity, quote, in March of this year, everybody realized that Bahrain was just too important to fail. Sounds like the banks. Too important to fail. We'll do whatever we have to back up the most corrupt and destructive institutions. So the question then is, why does it matter? Why are we having this gathering? Why are we having this event? Why is Bahrain any more or less important than any other country or example? Several points to make here very quickly. Number one, moral case. How on earth in the 21st century can we stand by and allow a king, a ruler, to turn his security forces on his own people in this brutal way? With torture, with shootings, with tear gassing, not just his own security forces, but to invite in the even more repressive and brutal security forces of his neighbour, his boss, the Saudis, 2,000 troops which arrived initially. How can we stand by morally in an age of humanitarian intervention, in the age of human rights, in the age of universal principles, in an age where we're told we can't stand by and allow ethnic cleansing, sectarian cleansing, genocide, etc. to take place, and yet this is going on. We know it's going on. Not only do we turn a blind eye, we praise the rulers. They turn up on our doorsteps, we shake their hands. So morally, it is disgusting to see so many people turning a blind eye to what's going on in Bahrain. Number two, there's our own UK role. We talked about America. let's not forget, those of us who are Brits, what are we doing? What's our culpability and responsibility? The British government, which has long had a relationship with Bahrain of the most awful kind. Ian Henderson was the British security officer in the 80s and 90s who presided over all of the torture against the initial calls for democracy and human rights. So much so that the European Parliament passed a resolution demanding that Britain take Ian Henderson out of Bahrain. Such were his abuses of human rights as documented by Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, etc., etc. Ironically, guess who's going out to reform the Bahraini police now? John Yates, another British police officer, so well known for his role in failing to stop phone hacking, and yet he's going to have a second lease of life, probably with a wonderful tax-free income, giving the advice to the Bahraini police. Earlier this year, of course, the Queen invited the Bahraini king to the royal wedding of William and Kate, while he was cracking down. The embossed invitation went out to Milan. The Crown Prince came in April and met David Cameron on the doorstep of Downing Street. Big handshake. You've heard that phrase, blood on our hand. Literally. Turned up. This week, the King turned up. Got a nice soft ride in Downing Street. Got a very soft ride from the Telegraph. If you want to talk about media bias, read Con Coughlin's interview with the King of Bahrain in the Telegraph this week. Can you imagine the Telegraph running an interview with Ahmadinejad, which was so soft and so deferential and so indulgent? So we British, and don't forget, this is not just about the Tories, the Labour government also sold the Bahrainis submachine guns, tear gas, riot shields, sniper rifles, smoke canisters, stun grenades, many of which were used in putting down the uprising. Our government, we, you and I as taxpayers, culpable. So we have a special responsibility, a special British reason to care about Bahrain. The third reason is the geopolitics of this. If Bahrain is ignored, and if the Bahraini king is allowed to get away with it, then what you're doing is you're crippling the whole of the Arab Spring. Because what you're saying is there's actually a route out to those dictators who should be having sleepless nights wondering when the people are coming for them. Instead, the dictators of the Middle East who are still in office can look at Bahrain and say, actually, there is a model for getting out of this trouble. We don't have to go the way of Ben Ali or Mubarak or Gaddafi. We can stick it out like the king of Bahrain, do our deals with the foreign powers, enable Western media to turn a blind eye, etc., etc., because nobody cares. If Bahrain is allowed to be ignored, then God help the rest of the Middle East. God help the people of Saudi Arabia. You know, you want to hear I always say there's only two words. There's only two words to use when somebody in a British government or American government talks about the importance of backing freedom and democracy in the Middle East. Saudi and Arabia. Those are the two words. And it's ironic that the Saudis are the ones bolstering the Bahrainis, because the Saudis know that if Bahrain falls, their own eastern provinces, which have a Shia majority and have all the oil, will be next. And so the Saudis have their own interest. They treat Bahrain like America used to treat Cuba in its backyard. People say the Bahraini king invited in the Saudis. I doubt it. I don't think the Saudis needed an invitation. So you have the geopolitical, geostrategic case for why Bahrain is important in the context of the wider Arab Spring. And of course, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia, there's the whole issue of this proxy war. Anyone who's following events in the Middle East knows of the proxy Cold War going on between Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Iran on the other. And a lot of the conflicts in the Middle East can seen through the prism of Saudi v Iran. Ironically, the Bahrainis were the ones to push this, big time. Every Arab regime that's been on the verge of falling says these are foreign powers. These are not the people. These are outside provocateurs. No difference in Bahrain. They said it was the Iranians. The International Crisis Group, one of the world's most respected foreign affairs think tanks, published a report at the time saying there is no evidence of direct Iranian involvement in the current Bahraini uprising so far. They said that Bahrain Shias, there's no credible indication of disloyalty on the part of Bahrain Shias. Indeed, there is little evidence that the Shia community's political objectives have been shaped by outsiders. The BICI report, published last month, the King's own report came out and said, we could not find any evidence of Iranian involvement in these protests. These are indigenous protests. The Bahrainis, if you read the King's interview in the Telegraph this week, they don't want to hear it. No, it's definitely Iran. And the Saudis, it's Iran. The Bahrainis say, we can't tell you, we've got some secret evidence. So secret you couldn't give it to your own commission that you commissioned to find out what's going on. In fact, God bless the guys at WikiLeaks, 2008 US State Department cable sent by the embassy in Manama to the State Department in Washington, D.C., in which the American official writes, quote, Bahraini government officials sometimes privately tell US official visitors that some Shia oppositionists are backed by Iran. Each time this claim is raised, we ask the government of Bahrain to share its evidence. To date, we have seen no convincing evidence of Iranian weapons or government money here since at least the mid-1990s. In our assessment, if the government of Bahrain had convincing evidence of more recent Iranian subversion, it would quickly share it with us. That's a private cable from the Americans to back home to Washington, D.C. There's no reason for them not to want to exaggerate Iran's role. Even in private, they're saying there ain't any evidence. This is indigenous. These are local people. This is people asking for help. And this leads me to my fourth and final point. I'll try and be brief, because some of you might not like this point, and it might make me unpopular in the room, but that's never stopped me before. How many of you in the room tonight are Shias? Just out of interest, raise your hands. Pretty much 90% of the room, I would say, my rough estimate of that handshake. In my experience, just following this year's events and going on some of the Bahraini protests and following some of the debate on the internet in places like this, the Shias here in the UK and the West have done two things wrong when it comes to the Middle East uprisings, and they're both related one to the other. Number one, we have been obsessed only with Bahrain while ignoring other uprisings in the region, other protests in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, etc. And my view, and feel free to disagree, is that we cannot afford to be so monomaniacally obsessed with just one region, one conflict, one issue. Otherwise, we look like we're a special interest, we're asking for special favours, it's special pleading, we're navel-gazing. Suddenly, you see, mashallah, good sign, the politicisation of British Muslims, Shia Muslims who never really get off their backsides and do anything. And this year, hundreds of people turned up to protest outside the Bahraini embassy. It's good. But do they then go and protest outside other embassies of other autocratic and dictatorial regimes? Or do we leave that to others? We're only caring about this country because it affects us in a kind of weird, navel-gazing, sectarian way. I think that's damaging. Number two, and this is a related point, we Shias cannot afford to simply target certain people we don't like, and when people we like do bad things, we turn a blind eye. It's not morally right, because it makes you hypocritical, and it's politically mad. You want to talk about going to the media and highlighting issues? Well, I'll tell you what, most people in the British media, when they hear Shia, think Iran. And if Shias in this country can only say that what happens in Bahrain is wrong, but can never say what happens in Iran is wrong, or in Syria is wrong, then we have absolutely no credibility when it comes to making a case for Bahrain. You can't say, for example, as a Shia friend of mine recently in a majlis said to me, well, Syria is a different case. It's no different to the man who said to me that Bahrain is complicated. Assad has killed more than 5,000 people according to the latest UN figures. And yet Shias think, well, the Sunnis will take power, therefore they turn a blind eye. We're deeply hypocritical to do that. You either take an approach which says human rights is for everyone, freedom is for everyone, democracy is for everyone in that region of the world, regardless of whether they are Sunni or Shia, or you might as well sit at home, because you have no credibility in the eyes, especially in the eyes of the West, which see the Middle East as a sectarian hellhole anyway. And we can't afford to confirm or enforce those biases. We're only shooting ourselves in the foot. We have to, Majid Nawaz of the Quilliam Foundation, not a man many of you may agree with, not a man I often agree with, he had a wonderful tweet though a few weeks ago. He said the problem in the Middle East is the Sunnis don't care about what's happening in Bahrain and the Shias don't care about what's happening in Syria. I think that's a valid point. We need to be speaking out for all of the people in the Middle East. Now I understand, having said that, let me add my proviso. Of course Bahrain is a special case, as I said at the start, because it's the ignored revolution. And I totally understand, I am a Shia, why we Shias would want to draw attention to Bahrain, because it's not getting attention, of course, and we should continue to do so. All I'm saying is not forget the others. Let's do as much as we can for Bahrain, inshallah. In fact, let me finish by saying this. In March, at the height of the pro-democracy protests in Bahrain, a crowd gathered outside the US Embassy in Manama, carrying signs that read, "Stop supporting dictators and give me liberty or give me death," slogans from the American Revolution. A US Embassy official emerged from the building with a box of donuts for the protesters. And one of the clerics in the crowd, he said, "These sweets are a good gesture, but we hope it's translated into practical action." It hasn't been. There's no sign of any practical action from Western governments in order to stop the violence and killing in Bahrain. But the fact remains that the Bahrainis, like every Arab, like every resident of the Middle East, have human rights. They deserve the right to live in freedom and dignity without having to suffer from persecution or oppression or discrimination. Bahrainis deserve, as I wrote this in a piece in The Guardian, they deserve democracy, not donuts from the West or from the Americans or from anyone else. That is the campaign we should be pushing. That is the struggle that we should be struggling for. That is what you and I as British citizens, as Muslims, as Shias, as believers in universal human rights and freedom, should be pushing for and making our voices heard and making sure that their message is heard here. Where 2011 they've been forgotten, let's try and change things in 2012. Thank you very much for your time.